Coming up on Chasing the Natty, the CFF game gets harder and harder as our rosters get solidified, but that doesn't mean we can't find some good gems on the waiver wire post Week 8. We'll tackle some disappointing performers at this point in the season, and then we'll be covering the players that you could be adding to your roster, which can help you as you push for the playoffs in your CFF leagues. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
To go, breaks the tackle, he's 10, he's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton caught the defense! Touchdown, Luther Burton! Milrow gonna run it again, got a lane, kicked in the turbo, Milrow! Goodbye, touchdown Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday and Wednesday morning during the season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we're doing here, head on over to campusofcanton.com. Subscribe there with any of our phenomenal tiers. We have content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether it's CFF, Devy, C2C, College IDP, College DFS. Really, if you play it, then we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. If you want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me in the show on Twitter. I'm at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty, and if you have not already, show us some love by leaving a like, a comment, and subscribe if you're on the YouTube side of things. And then if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you leave a 5-star review and make sure you're following the show wherever you are listening. Not only does that support us, but you're also supporting the game of college fantasy football in general. Y'all, for a wild week of college football. I know we say that every single week, but that's what makes this sport so incredible, is that as much time as we put into, breaking down the analytics, diving over the film, just taking every millisecond of action that we can get, we cannot predict what is going to happen in this sport. There are so many outcomes every single week that just come out of nowhere that completely surprise you. I mean, shoot, I'm still having to wrap my head around the fact that an Army quarterback, a triple option quarterback, is currently the QB1 in all of CFF, right? With Ashton Gianti out, we had both Mario Anderson and Bayshal Tootin and Jaden Ball all do their best impressions of him in his honor, of course. Some other great things happen. We have the SEC trying to gaslight everybody into thinking that pass interference is a reviewable call, and they did not overturn it just because they were intimidated by the crowd. No, not at all. I won't go into that. But, you know me, I'm a Georgia homer, and I'm going to throw something out like that. Anyway, you guys know, this sport's incredible. We love it. And as we get later on into the season here, it's getting harder and harder to really... It's getting harder and harder to really go about... How do I say this? The time to really overhaul your roster is basically over, right? We've had our chances. We had our preconceived notions coming into the season, right? A lot of it we were right on. A lot of it we were wrong on. But at the same time, we've kind of had the first half of the season to really kind of adjust. We have a pretty good idea of how things are shaping out in the world of college football, but also in CFF in general, right? We basically know who the guys are. And the kind of guys that pop up later in the season are very few and far between. So with that being said, I will go ahead and let you know today's probably going to be a little bit shorter of a show. In addition to the fact that I'm not going to stretch myself to recommend guys to you guys that I really don't think are actually going to help your rosters at this point, right? If you're a contender, you've already picked up a ton of guys over the last couple of weeks. If you're somebody who's kind of out of it, your options are limited. I am sorry to say that. It's just that point in the season where there's not really a ton of guys that are coming out. Not to say that the guys I'm going to talk about here today aren't great, but it's just kind of how it is. In addition, I just didn't have as much time today to really dive into it, just being fully honest with you guys. But also, like I said, like I'm not going to recommend to you guys people that I personally wouldn't even be really looking to put onto my own rosters, right? So it'll be a little bit shorter of an episode today, but I hope you guys do enjoy the players that we do talk about here today. But before we get into that, if you guys know the drill by now, right? We're going to talk about some player. We're going to go to the freakout scale first here. Talk about some players that, you guys are a little bit worried about, whether it's, you guys have been DMing me, or I always go to our NIL members over at campusofcanton.com and just directly ask their input on who they want to hear me talk about. So we got 4 players today. We've been doing 2 each week the last couple of weeks, but I think this is a week where I'm kind of okay with doing 4 because there's some big time names that people want discussed. So I will fit it into here. And then, of course, after that, we will then get into the actual waiver wire players. So let's get to it. Let's not dilly-dally any longer. Let's go over to our freakout scale. And we got 2 sets, as I mentioned today, and we're going to first talk about 2 wide receivers that have been giving people some heartache. 2 guys that went in the first round of CFF drafts. Man, oh man, it's not been pretty for first-round quarterbacks and first-round wide receivers in CFF this year. Guys that we thought were just locked in, run it back, they're going to do it again, and it's just not turned out that way. So our 2 wide receivers we'll be talking about here today are 1, Tet McMillan out of Arizona, and then Mr. Luther Burton, wide receiver out of Missouri. So where do we have them on the freakout scale? We'll start with Tet McMillan. I have him at a 5. Chris K's got him at a 4. I'm definitely like if my 5 had a scale in of its own, I'd be leaning towards the 4. Like I'm probably as low as I can get on a 5. And then Nate Marquise has him at a 1. Nate Marquise is not worried about him at all. And I can't get there. I think there's legitimate reason to worry about Tet McMillan and his value going forward, right? And that sounds crazy on the surface because in total points on the season, McMillan's wide receiver 14. He's wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game, right? So you're sitting here thinking like, okay, he's not been great the last couple of weeks, right? He had, 10.3 fantasy points versus BYU in half PPR formats. This past week, he had 6.3 versus Colorado. But, if that's where he's at on the season, like he can't be that much worse than everybody else, right? And my initial thought was like, okay, maybe we're looking at a rougher end to the season here. And so I checked my rest of season rankings here, and they currently have McMillan as wide receiver 22 in total fantasy points and wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game. So not much of a change between the first half and the back half of the season here. There's one major problem, though, that's really kind of faking out these numbers, and that is that very first game. The first game of the season where Arizona came out and they put on an absolute show with McMillan. 4 touchdowns, over 300 yards. He scored almost 60 fantasy points in half PPR formats in that first week. If you look at his total fantasy points on the year, he's at 125. So just under half of his fantasy production for the year came in just that one game. If you take away just half that performance, I'm not asking you to take away all 60 points, right? That sounds crazy. But if you take away half that performance, so he still has a 30-point day. That's a really good day for a wide receiver. You bring him back down to a 30-point game there, he is down to wide receiver 45 in total points. It looks good, but it is very much a mirage. The production's here, right? He's over 700 yards on the year, but again, 300 of those came in a singular game. But beyond that, he is less than 50 yards in 3 of his games in the last 6 games here. He's got some 100-yard plus performances, but he also hasn't had a touchdown since week 1. And I would normally kind of chalk that up to a fluke, right? I'd be like, okay, positive regression is coming. He's got 700 yards, right? He should have roughly around, 7 touchdowns. So 3 touchdowns got to come from somewhere here soon. He's going to make up for that. Problem is, Arizona's offense is hot doo-doo. Noah Fifita has completely regressed this year. Regress even sounds like a tame term for what Noah Fifita is going through right now. He currently on the year has more interceptions than touchdowns. He has 10 interceptions, 9 touchdowns. Brent Brennan came in, and I know Brent Brennan can run a good offense, but I don't think he can with Noah Fifita. I think that there is a serious disconnect between the kind of offense that Brent Brennan wants to run and what Noah Fifita can do. No Fafita, appreciate you, man. You committed to your school, right? You love Arizona. You want to play with Tet, right? But this isn't working out for you, man. And it's not working out for anybody on this offense. This offense has been atrocious recently. And Tet McMillan has been a huge casualty of that. And the problem is I don't see it getting any better from here on out. Like, hold on, let me look up Arizona's schedule here real quick. Because, it's not... Like, obviously, Arizona plays in the Big 12, so there's some opportunity there. But again, West Virginia, UCF, Houston, TCU, Arizona State. Again, none of these are like, I would refuse to start, insert random quarterback, insert random wide receiver against those teams. Problem is, like, I don't see it getting any better for Arizona compared to what they've had before this point. Like, yeah, Utah was a tough matchup. BYU was kind of tough, but, like, only putting up 22 points versus Texas Tech. 7 points versus Colorado, 7 points versus Kansas State, right? You haven't had a good offensive performance since week 1 against New Mexico. And New Mexico's defense is legitimately one of the worst in the country. So I'm quite worried about Tet McMillan. Thing is, he's still getting his targets most games, right? In 4 out of the last 5 games, he's had 9 targets, right? 9 plus targets. In 3 of those, he's had 11 plus targets. So it's all still there, right? There's still some connection there. Like I mentioned before, he's had 100+ yard games. He just hasn't found the end zone. So, like, I think McMillan will still have good games down the stretch. The problem is, compared to where you drafted him at, this is very much, 1, a very disappointing year. But also, 2, like, I don't think you can still rely on him like you thought you could going into the season. So, yeah, I got McMillan as a 5. I think, not that there's tons of options out there at this point, but trying to bolster up, maybe trade for another wide receiver might be the best option for you if you're still able to trade in your leagues. The other wide receiver we got to talk about here is Luther Burton, the wide receiver out of Missouri. This is a guy that was being drafted sometimes wide receiver 1, especially once we thought McMillan was going to be injured to start the year. But mostly it was kind of in that wide receiver 2-3 range, depending on how you felt about Torrey Horton, which... that's its own mess over there about what's going on with him. But Burton is another kind of interesting one, right? Where there's not an obvious culprit here as to why Burton is producing less this year. Or I think there is, but like I'll get to that in a second. Because when you look at it, right, he's wide receiver 25 in total points. Last year he finished as wide receiver 14. So like, in CFF, at least, that's not a huge difference in season to season. Problem is, again, when you break down by fantasy points per game, Luther Burton is at wide receiver 37, so that is a pretty big drop from last year. And when I look at my rest of the season rankings, they actually really don't like him moving forward. They have him at wide receiver 49 in total points moving forward, and wide receiver 46 in fantasy points per game moving forward. So, to me, like, on the surface, like, I'm not entirely sure what's... Sorry, I'm a little off here today, guys. Bear with me. My deal with Luther Burton is, like, half the time you're still kind of getting what you want, right? Against Boston College, 20.7 half-point PPR, right? Against Vanderbilt, 22.6 half-point PPR points. Against UMass, 21.2 half-point PPR points. But then against Auburn, 7.9. Against Texas A&M, 11.8. Against Buffalo, 11.1, right? The floor is still kind of here, right? Like, he's only had 10 or less fantasy points in half PPR formats once this season. So he's not like killing your rosters every single week, but he's also not ever doing what we thought he would do. Last year he was killer under Kirby Moore's offense. So it's like, what happened? Well, I took a look at Brady Cook because I'm thinking like, okay, Brady Cook's got to have regressed from last year. And not as much. There is some regression for sure, right? He's throwing less completion percentage, but it's only like 3%. His yards per attempt is lower than last year. Last year he's throwing at 9.1 yards per attempt. Now he's at 7.5, and that can add up over time, right? And when I took a look at Luther Burton's ADOT, there wasn't a huge difference. So it's not like Luther Burton's the reason why that came down. What I do notice is that we're over halfway through the season and Brady Cook has 7 touchdowns. Compared to last year, Brady Cook finished the season with 20. Currently, he's on pace for about 14, 15 touchdowns. So that definitely hurts Luther Burton because he has not scored a touchdown in 3 games, and he's only got 4 on the year so far. That's a pretty drastic change from last year, if I do recall off the top of my head, because last year, Mr. Burton, if I can pull up his stats real quick. Yeah, last year, Luther Burton scored 9 touchdowns total in the season. Now, he can still reach that again this year, but even still, I am worried about Luther Burton. I got him at a 6. Nate Marquise has got him at a 6 as well. Kay is a little less worried than us at a 4. My problem is that I think very similar to Arizona, obviously not to the same degree, this Mizzou offense just isn't as good. I think that's kind of the main thing. And also, like, Luther Burton's targets are down just in general as well. Last year, he finished the season with 117 targets. Currently, he is on pace for less than 100 in the regular season currently. So I don't know if that's part of the game plan. I don't know if people are covering Luther Burton a little bit better. This is definitely a very disappointing year for Luther Burton compared to last year. Very similar with Tet, though. I think Luther Burton is still a playable wide receiver. But I would also not be completely opposed to trading for or targeting wide receivers on the waiver wire just in case things don't really get better from here. Our other 2 freakout scale candidates today are 2 quarterbacks, 2 top SEC quarterbacks, guys that people are talking about as potential first rounders in the NFL draft next year, depending on who you talk to. We got to talk about Jaylen Miller and Carson Beck. How did some people kind of bring up Jaylen Miller recently? And I'm letting you know right now, Nate's got him at a 1, Kay's got him at a 1, I got him at a 2, like slightly, because like, a 14-point performance last week is, not great, right? Less than 60% completion, 2 interceptions, barely any rushing yards, right? Like, I don't want to see more of that, so I'm like a little concerned there, but I'm still starting Milroe in most places, right? Like, I know that Alabama's been on a skid recently. Like, ever since they won against Georgia, like, it's just things have not been the same. Milroe, 23.4 fantasy points versus Vandy, 27, almost 28 points versus South Carolina, and then obviously the big dud this past week with Milroe, throwing 45 times and completing only 25 of them for 239. Regardless, he finishes the day with just under 15 fantasy points there in 4-point passing touchdown leagues. I get that people are slightly concerned because clearly this is a downgrade compared to where we were to start the year, right? He started the year with 39.9, 28, 39.34, 46 versus Georgia, and it looked like Milroe was unstoppable. He was, he's unbenchable. He's matchup proof. All the words we love to use about certain prospects, right? And now he looks more vulnerable. So I get why people are slightly a little bit freaked out, but he's still producing well for you guys, right? South Carolina's won. South Carolina's defense, legit. They have a really, really good defense. Tennessee's defense, also quite legit. And they were playing at Tennessee. That definitely hurt them. They played at Vandy, and Vandy's defense is a little bit better than we initially thought. And also, that was just a game where Milroe just wasn't monopolizing the touchdowns like he was in previous games, right? Yes, we're clearly in a place where his fantasy points per game over the last 3 games is much lower than it was the first 4 games. He's still a very viable weekly option in CFF, and he still has a skill set that can take the top off of any matchup whenever he does turn it on. So yeah, I have no concern about Milroe. Carson Beck, on the other hand, Nate's got him at a 10. Like, Nate straight up said when I asked him, like, Carson Beck should not be rostered in a standard league. To which I disagree slightly, because it's not like Carson Beck hasn't had good performances, right? He had 30 points versus Tennessee Tech, 30 points versus Bama, 30 points versus Mississippi State. There are certainly pieces there for Carson Beck to have himself really nice days for CFF purposes, right? Especially in a 6-point passing touchdown league. Problem is, it's getting harder to really kind of guess when he's going to have his off days or not, right? Because at Kentucky, that was a complete disaster performance for UJ's offense in that game. Carson finishes the day with 8.2 fantasy points. Against Auburn, at home, UJ puts up 31 points. Carson Beck throws 2 touchdowns, but he finishes the day with less than 250 yards, and he finishes the day with 16 fantasy points. Not great, obviously. I think a lot of people were kind of asking me about putting this on the Freakout list. We're kind of asking from a more Devy perspective, and I'm not going to sit here and say like I'm a Devy expert, so I'm not going to really speak too much on that. From a CFF perspective, though, if you are relying on Carson Beck, then yeah, I think you have to bench him now. I think you got to let him kind of see. Well, I don't even know. I was about to say let Georgia kind of figure out their offense, but again, we're freaking 7 games into the season, right? Like, Georgia's offense is what it is. It's going to be inconsistent game to game right now. And so, to me, Beck has to be on the bench. I don't think you need to drop him fully because, like, there are other guys. Like, if you were to ask me who would I rather have in CFF right now, I'd rather have Carson Beck or Nico Iamaleava. I'd have Carson Beck easily. Like, Nico Iamaleava, to me, in a redraft league, is not rosterable right now. He has not had a single good performance so far this year, versus Carson Beck has at least had some 30-plus point performances in recent memory, right? So, but I would definitely just keep him on the bench unless you had a for sure matchup that you knew for a fact that Beck could take advantage of. And even then, like, I'm not sure there's such thing at this point. So that's my thoughts on all of that. Those are our Freakout Scale candidates of the week. Let's move on to some actual players to pick up off the waiver wire this week. So like I mentioned, we're going through a bit of a shorter show today. I say that as I realize I'm 20 minutes into the show already, so I'll try to pick up the pace here soon. But normally I try to put about 5 players up for you guys to choose between off your waiver wires. I'm going to put up 3 per position today and only 1 tight end. Again, just unfortunately didn't have as much time to really dive into it as I wanted to this weekend, but we're also, again, like I said, at that point in the season where there's just not as many options, so I'm not going to stretch myself to include some of those. Similar to the last couple of weeks, though, we'll start with our quarterbacks here. And you notice I put my honorable mentions up here first because the value at quarterbacks is still with guys that I've mostly talked about already, right? Caden Veltkamp, still 30% rostered. Ben Wooldridge, who just had himself a near 40-point performance this past week, he's still available in 73 or 77% of rosters. Sawyer Robertson, 5-touchdown day this past week against Texas Tech, available in 90% of rosters. Kevin Jennings, the new top quarterback for SMU. You know, not a guy that's going to blow the top off of any weekend, but dang, is he a good, like, floor play every single week for SMU. And then Spencer Petras just got done with an absolute shootout there with New Mexico State. He had himself a really nice day this past week. And that doesn't even include some of the other guys, you know, like Tyler Huff that are still available on a lot of rosters, right? To me, if you're going for quarterback, I would check these guys first, and then we get to some of these guys like Colton Joseph, quarterback out of Old Dominion, who's rostered on 2% of rosters. And this past week against Texas State, which I will admit, this is a pretty impressive performance, or Old Dominion beating Texas State this past weekend was definitely one of the bigger surprises I had on the docket. But this past week, Joseph threw the ball 28 times, completed 15 of them, didn't complete 15% of his passes, completed 15 of them for 130 yards, no touchdowns to the air, but he had 16 carries on the ground for 111 yards and 3 touchdowns. So, when Old Dominion first made their switch back at quarterback a few weeks ago, I was a little skeptical to really believe in Joseph. I didn't really think that, you know, I wasn't really buying into, you know, Old Dominion's offense just in general, right? I'd seen a couple of quarterbacks come through, and I get a little excited about them because, again, I know this offense that came over from Norfolk is kind of interesting, but it hasn't really taken off at Old Dominion. And for the most part, I've been proven right with Old Dominion, but since Joseph's come in, he's kind of made me a believer out of him becoming a CFF producer against other Sunbelt competition, right? So let's take a look at the last 3 weeks that he's had here. He has solidified himself as a dual threat force in the Sunbelt, right? He's seen 10-plus carries in each of his last 3 games. He's finished with 68, 98, and 111 yards, respectively, on the ground in his last few games, right? He's found the end zone with his legs 4 times during that stretch, so 4 rushing touchdowns, 3 this past week. So, obviously, I love that part of his game. His passing game could definitely use some work, right? He's been held under 150 yards each of his last 2 games against Texas State and Georgia State. The Texas State one I'm not as worried about because, you know, Texas State's secondary is actually pretty solid. The Georgia State performance was definitely a little bit more worrying because Georgia State is 99th in the country against the pass, so that's rough. But yes. Yeah. However, Joseph's upcoming schedule, though, does provide some relief, right? Again, I don't love the fact that he didn't perform well against Georgia State, but he gets Georgia Southern and he gets App State coming up. Both of these games have him facing against teams ranked 110th plus in defensive passing team performance. So that'll help him out quite a bit there. And his legs are not going to be limited, so he'll be able to use both sides of his game there. Because both App State and Georgia Southern, they're bad against the pass. They're even worse against the rush. They're both 120th plus in defensive rushing team performance. By the way, these stats that I am bringing to you are brought over from our C2C Winning Edge package if you ever want to take a look and dive into those numbers yourself. So obviously got some good matchups coming up for Colton Joseph. I love the dual threat ability, the fact that he's been very consistent there. I would love to see him get a little bit more touchdowns. I mean, he had 4 touchdowns versus Coastal Carolina, 3 versus Texas State, but he only had 1 versus Georgia State. I think that, against Georgia Southern, against App State, we should have some pretty good ones. I think he's a solid plug and play over the next 3 weeks if you're looking for a quarterback that can help you weather the storm of some bye weeks. So, moving on to our next quarterback here on the list, it is Mr. Jakori Brown, quarterback out of UCF. Rostered on 8% of rosters this past week. 20 passes, completed 8 of them for 62 yards, but then also had 13 carries for 154 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. So before we get to Brown, I guess we should address the elephant in the room that has been the big disappointment that has been KJ Jefferson as the quarterback of Gus Malzahn's UCF Golden Knights here. After, the success of John Rice Plumlee under Malzahn, I really thought Jefferson was going to be, fit right into the system like a glove. Well, here we are after week 8. The highest rank that Jefferson's achieved on the season has been QB 32 after week 5, which quickly dropped back down to QB 62. It was pretty clear that a change at quarterback was needed. Jefferson just wasn't working out. It was pretty clear, especially after the Florida game. So they then started E.J. Colson, which the true freshman quarterback, but that lasted for about 5 minutes before they switched to who we all thought was going to be the backup quarterback, and that is Miami transfer Jakori Brown here. So based on what we've seen out of Jakori Brown over the last 2 games, this is fitting a little bit more what we expected a Gus Malzahn quarterback to perform with, right? And it's been to UCF's benefit, right? Brown's first game started him involving him throw 20 times for 270 yards and 84 yards on the ground, finishing with 20 fantasy points. So a pretty solid debut there for Brown, even though UCF was struggling big time to move the ball against Cincinnati. That game ended, I think, 19-13, so very low scoring game there. But this past week against a pretty stout Iowa State defense, Brown both progressed and regressed, right? He regressed in the fact that his passing day was absolutely atrocious. I already mentioned it, right? He completed just 8 of his 20 passes for 62 yards. That's just not going to get it done. No matter what, it almost got it done against Iowa State because they just ran the ball so well. Speaking of which, Brown gave the Cyclones absolute fits on the ground, rushing 13 times for 154 yards and 2 touchdowns. The combination of having both Brown and Harvey on the ground opens this UCF offense back up in a way that I don't think we've really seen since the start of the season, and is much more conducive to what they want to do against some Big 12 competition here. As I kind of mentioned before, the passing's got to improve. I don't think there's any hiding that, but if Brown can continue to do what he's doing and get even close to what Plumlee was able to do in his final 2 years under Malzahn, I think Brown's fit within the system could be a massive benefit for CFF managers down the stretch. Lest we forget that when Plumlee was healthy, he was pretty consistently averaging a top 12 finish in CFF weekly performances, right? I will say there is a pretty big caveat here. I do not love this upcoming schedule for UCF and Brown. They got BYU, who's had a very surprisingly great defense on board, and they got both Arizona schools on the schedule, which Arizona State is 37th versus the pass in defensive passing team performance, and then You get Arizona State after that, which, the passing opens back up a little bit. There's 76 in that metric, but then the rushing, which is obviously what Brown does so well, is down to 22nd versus Arizona State. So a bit of pick your poison with Brown over the next couple of weeks, right? But the other caveat with this is, as much as I can look at those numbers and say, like, oh, that's some bad matchups right there. If Brown and UCF can put up 35 points versus Iowa State, I don't think there's any reason not to believe in the fact that they can also do the same against the likes of BYU. I mean, it's not like BYU, they gave out 35 points to Oklahoma State this past week. So, like, I don't think that this is a defense that's invulnerable. Arizona is definitely not invulnerable. I mean, good Lord, look what Colorado did to them this past week. And then Arizona State, that's probably the one that I think they're the most consistent defense, but again, obviously can be taken advantage of. So I like Jakori Brown moving forward. Again, Gus Malzahn quarterback. It's hard not to pass up on that. I'm a little hesitant about the schedule, but we'll see how it goes from here. Last quarterback that we'll talk about here today is one Mr. Tav Jackson, the quarterback out of Indiana, rostered on 4% of rosters. This past week, 7 completions on 8 attempts for 91 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also had 2 rushing attempts for 21 yards. Very similar to Jakori Brown. This is a scenario where we're benefiting from a backup quarterback position, right? If you were somebody that is struggling at quarterback, unfortunately, starting quarterbacks means guys go down and their backups are usually, at least in redraft, available on the waiver wire, and you kind of have your second chance to go after guys in pretty solid CFF systems here, right? So I will say, at first, I wasn't going to recommend this recommendation because based on what I heard, that Curtis Rourke would probably be back sooner rather than later. But now we do have official confirmation that Rourke will be out a, quote, indefinite amount of time, and that Tav Jackson will be the starter next week against Washington. So normally when you're playing CFF, right, the starter goes down and a change is made at quarterback, there's a desire to go out and just grab the backup and see where he goes. But you also kind of have to be somewhat hesitant. You got to have a little bit of caution. You got to make sure that the skill sets of whatever that new starter is going into your system is going to be the same as the starter you had before. Otherwise, you're going to have to recalculate what you expect from that offense. But with Kirk Cignetti, I don't think we have to worry about that, right? Cignetti, as one of my partners, Nate Marquise, would say, is a kingmaker at quarterback position, right? The last 2 years, not only in the last 2 years has Cignetti provided us with really good CFF quarterbacks, right? Todd Centeio was a top 20 quarterback in the year that he played, and then Jordan McLeod was a top 12 quarterback for CFF last year. But you listen to those two names, Todd Centeio and Jordan McLeod, those guys were literal crap. These were guys that everybody in the CFF community had just completely written off because, they've been to multiple spots before and they've never been good before, but man, they start in a Cignetti offense, and they, like I said, they both finished as top 20 quarterbacks for their respective years, despite their many, many limitations. Cignetti is a absolute wonder king when it comes to actually taking these quarterbacks and fitting them into his system, molding his system around them, and playing to their strengths. And quite frankly, I should really be done doubting him, because I even doubted Cignetti would be able to get his offense up and running in year one at Indiana. I figured it would take a year or two. I like the idea of him at Indiana, but I thought it wouldn't get up and running in year one. I thought that Curtis Rourke was a good placeholder quarterback for a year. He had one year left there, and then one of the younger guys might take over after that. But not only has Cignetti just proved me wrong, he's gone above that, right? The Hoosiers are 7-0. Curtis Rourke was a top 14 quarterback in CFF going into the bye week, right? I'm done doubting Cignetti. I'm done doubting his system and really whoever he has back there under center. I trust that Cignetti will play to Jackson's strengths if there is any difference really between him and Rourke's game here. So the last thing that's kind of a hang up here is I don't love Indiana's upcoming schedule. But here's the thing. I just watched Indiana absolutely destroy Nebraska this past week. And Nebraska, according to our numbers, the C2C winning edge is the sixth ranked team in the country when it comes to team defensive performance. So on paper, a 3-game stretch against Washington, who's 27th in the same metric, Michigan State, who is 56th in the same metric, and Michigan, who's 18th, should scare me. But frankly, again, I'm done doubting the staff. I think that they'll find a way to have some really good performances over the next 3 weeks, even though it looks like these are tough matchups. So I trust the staff to get this job done. I think Jackson's a pretty clear pickup, especially if you've been relying on Rourke. But if you've just been struggling at quarterback in general, I think Jackson's a great pickup over the next couple of weeks while Curtis Rourke figures out what's going on with his hand. So, that being said, then we can now move on to some running backs. Go touch on those after I take a sip of water here. All right. Here we go. So first one, unfortunately, I'm letting you know right now, this is not a guy you need to be picking up if you are looking at someone who is, an immediate starter for this week, right? Because AJ Turner here, the running back on Marshall, rostered on 13% of leagues. He is on a bye this week, so that's kind of unfortunate. But also, as I kind of mentioned before, there are very rare instances where I feel really, really good about certain waiver wire pickups this late in the season. I think Turner's absolutely one of those, and it would be malpractice for me not to mention him by this point, right? This past week, he had a monster game versus Georgia State. 15 carries, 117 yards, and 3 touchdowns on the ground. He also had a catch for 30 yards and a touchdown to go along with that. So again, monster 4-touchdown performance day. Turner getting onto this waiver list has really been a long time coming, right? One of my greatest strengths, personally, as a CFF analyst is that I have a system where I target volume and I really try to stick with it. That has served me well over the years, but in certain instances, like with Turner here, it kind of causes me to wait way too long to come around on certain players just because I don't really like the fact they don't get the volume that I want, right? Such is the case with AJ Turner here, right? If you are looking at his game log here, right? He has not had more than 16 touches in a single game. And usually I'm a guy that likes at my running backs to be, consistently hitting, at least, 20, 25. Again, if you have a down game, if you're down at like 16 for like one game, I'm okay with that. But otherwise, I stick with that, right? But sometimes you got guys here like AJ Turner where they don't need that volume to perform every single week. And a lot of times you got to just be able to trust that they're going to find the points one way or another. Again, 9 touches versus Western Michigan, 124 yards, no touchdowns there. But regardless, a great performance there. Obviously, 13.8 yards per carry. First 2 games of the season. Heck, against Virginia Tech, he had over 17 yards a carry, right? This is clearly a guy that doesn't need the volume, but I'm honestly excited to see if he can get even more volume moving forward as the staff, like me, comes around with the idea that, like, hey, this is one of the guys that we got, right? Marshall's been kind of an interesting team here this year, right? If you're a veteran of CFF, you don't really need me to remind you about the history, at least the recent history of the epic Marshall running backs we've had recently. Rasheen Ali, Kalen LeBourne, Brendan Knox, guys even before that, right? But this year, under Seth Dagey, the new offensive coordinator there, the Thundering Herd were expected to kind of become more like the Lightning Herd, really. They're airing the ball out more. They're trying to implement this kind of air raid system, which to me was wild. Like, I've never understood these teams that try to just completely overhaul the offensive scheme that they're trying to do, going from a heavy run scheme to we're going to try to air it out as much as possible. Like, granted, I get it in a way that, like, you're surprising your conference opponents, like, because they don't have to worry about planning for the same thing every year. But suffice it to say that the whole air raid thing with Marshall, at least for this year, just hasn't fully worked out. And because the Marshall staff are like me and they're stubborn, right, they're only just now really coming around to the conclusion that they have, and I should have made weeks ago, AJ Turner is clearly the best player on this team, and they need to feed him a ton. Right? He's been on absolute tear recently, and if he could get more volume. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. I am so sorry, y'all. I'm like off today. I'm like blanking on my brain. Like I said, Turner's been on absolute tear recently. And while I don't think he's rivaling GNT in efficiency, like, I think he's making GNT look over his shoulder, right? This guy has been absolutely phenomenal. Despite not having a game above 15 carries, Turner's finished with 95 plus rushing yards in 5 out of his last 7 games so far. He's averaged 10 plus yards per carry in 4 out of his last 7 games. And then this past week, like I said, the staff finally made him a featured part of this game plan, and he just went absolutely nuts for 4 touchdowns, right? I think the staff still wants to throw the ball as much as they can, but, when you have Stone Earl and Braylon Braxton stinking it up back there, I think their hands can be forced to feature Turner more if they want to be bowl-bound, right? Marshall's upcoming schedule, they got a bye this week, like I mentioned, but then they have a surprisingly stingy UM Monroe team to face, but then after that, you get a beautiful matchup against a Southern Miss squad that week, and then some nice Sun Belt matchups after that point. So I like AJ Turner quite a bit. Let's move on to our next running back. Let's touch on Mr. Delbert Mims, the running back out of Eastern Michigan, rostered on 11% of rosters. This past week, 21 attempts for 90 yards, no touchdowns. He also had 2 catches for 32 yards, no touchdowns there as well. But this is kind of the opposite of AJ Turner in a way, right? This is my kind of guy. This is, give me a guy that is volume based, right? But as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, true volume based, running back plays in CFF are kind of hard to come by this late in the season. But Mims is showing that doesn't mean they don't exist, right? Mims, was someone that we kind of kept an eye on during the offseason potential, big fish, small pond candidate. He's coming over from NC State there. He's playing in the MAC, right? But it's kind of taken Mims a minute to get going, but the last 3 weeks seem to indicate that something's kind of like a switch has been flipped here, right? Because over the last 3 weeks, the last 4 weeks, Mims has seen 23 touches, last 3 games. Last 3 weeks, or 4 weeks, 3 games. That's where I was confusing myself. Mims has seen 23 plus touches in all 3 of his games, right? He's piled up 95 plus yards in each of those games with his rushing and receiving combined. He's managed to find the end zone 3 times during that stretch as well. And quite frankly, one thing that's kind of surprised me is that Eastern Michigan's offense has really been high scoring recently. Because again, they put up 52 versus Kent State, 38 versus, they put up only 14 versus Miami of Ohio. I had that backwards. But then this past week, they put up 38 versus Central Michigan, a really cool comeback effort, right? But as long as they keep scoring, right, as long as we can consistently expect, 30-point performances, Delbert Mims is going to find the end zone, right? He's not going to have only, 3 touchdowns in 3 games here, and then a game like last week where he had 23 touches, but just never found the end zone. That's not something I expect moving forward. So he does have a kind of up and down schedule coming up this week. He has a golden opportunity against Akron, right? Pile up some stats. They're a defense ranked 115th in defensive rushing team performance there. After that, he gets a date with Toledo, who's 14th in that same stat, so maybe sit him that week. But then after that, some more nice MAC matchups there after the bye week. So I think that Mims, if you're like me and you like playing the volume game, you like guys that are just going to get plenty of touches at this point, I think you got to go with Mims. So moving on to our third running back of the day is another kind of volume-based play that, again, are kind of rare at this point in the season, but, we got a couple of options here, so I'm going to make sure you guys know about them. And that, our last running back that we really dive into here is Elijah Young, the running back out of Western Michigan, rostered on 9% of leagues. He's on bye this week, so again, if you're looking for a guy that's going to help you immediately, fortunately, that's not what you're getting here. But if you're struggling at running back and you just need some solid volume play, I think that Young is a guy that you can take a look at in addition to Mims, right? Yeah, if we look at his last 3 games here, right? 21 carries versus Boston College, only 16 carries versus UTEP, and then 23 carries versus Sam Houston this past week, which is also weird, right? Because I don't know, somebody check me into an insane asylum because I feel wrong recommending a Western Kentucky running back after the last couple of years, right? Just like I said, I can get stuck on volume. I can kind of get stuck on system history as well. The Western Kentucky running back the last couple of years for CFF has been absolute poison. And especially while Western Kentucky's been trying to replicate that same offensive success they had under Zach Kitley. But as they move further away, it seems like that more and more each year they are kind of relying on the running game a little bit more. And that's been a huge benefit to Elijah Young. Like, he's definitely transcending kind of the system history here over the last couple of years. One, because of his veteran status, right? He is a senior, and he's been with the program for 2 years now. But also, I do think he's also legitimately one of the Hilltoppers' best weapons, right? Both on the ground and through the air. Last 3 games, Young's gotten 20-plus carries in 2 of them, 85-plus yards in 2 of them. In the one game he didn't, he got 16 carries, 60 yards. We haven't seen a Western Kentucky running back get that kind of volume in a long time. The closest I could find in recent memory, here's a fun throwback name for some of y'all. Gage Walker, running back out of Western Kentucky back in 2019. So 5 years ago was the last time we had a running back at Western Kentucky that was even getting even close to this level of volume. But when it comes to Young, there are some concerns, right? Like, the touchdown opportunities, I think, are obviously concerned. If you look at his last 3 games, he's only scored 1 touchdown in those 3 games, and that was this past week. It was actually a receiving touchdown in that game. But West Kentucky has some really incredible matchups coming up, right? They get Kennesaw State and New Mexico State. They're both 110th plus in defensive rushing team performance. Right, a benefit of Young as well is his receiving work. In 2 of his last 3 games, he's been targeted 5 times. So even if Western Kentucky does kind of get pass happy, there's still some room for Young to perform well and actually kind of prefer his receiving work a little bit. He seems to be a lot more efficient with the receiving game sometimes. He can really take some of these screens, some of these angle routes to the house sometimes. So I like Young moving forward. I think he's a solid piece of this Western Kentucky offense moving forward. So that being said, let me throw out some honorable mentions to you guys. I don't have a graphic for this week, but just a couple of reminders to some guys you could take a look at. Some like Elijah Gillum out of Fresno State. Keep an eye out for Malik Sherrod news, right? Ahmad Hardy comes back this week out of UM Monroe after their bye week. I think they got a nice matchup this week. And then also, like, this is kind of similar to AJ Turner. I got to get myself unstuck sometimes, but Justice Ellison, the running back out of Indiana, is not a guy that I love in terms of, volume, right? He's gone between 9 and 14 carries per game. He's not a receiving back. He gets very limited opportunities, but dadgum does he love to score the ball. Like, he has a touchdown in every single game so far this year. He is up to 8 touchdowns in, 6 games for Indiana. I can't deny it's so abundantly clear that they are making sure that they get Ellison a touchdown in every single game. Now, as I say that, he's not going to score a touchdown this week for whatever reason, but I think I can't ignore it any longer. So let me get a sip of water here, and let's move on to our wide receivers for today. And I just realized, boy, we're already at 45 minutes. I'm just yapping away today. My apologies, y'all. But that's a problem because I actually kind of like these wide receivers, so I'm going to want to yap even more about them. First guy we got up here is Mr. Darius Lasser, the wide receiver out of BYU, rostered on 3% of leagues. He got 9 targets, 6 receptions, 129 yards, and a touchdown, including the 50-yard game winner at the buzzer beater for BYU this past week. I still can't really wrap my head around what BYU's doing this year. This is a team that many, including myself, just had left as an afterthought. We were thinking like, oh, this is a last place team in the Big 12, and now I think they're ranked 13th in the country now. But like during the offseason, like maybe you liked LJ Martin, which, by the way, check out his stats from his first game back healthy this past week. You're gonna love that. But otherwise, like, you were passing on the Cougars, right? Now you can't really ignore them any longer. Like, Jake Ratsuff has been a solid quarterback for CFF, and recently it seems like he's found himself a new number 1 target in Darius Lasser, right? Lasser has been a pretty key part of this team all offseason, but in recent weeks, it seems to have been taken to another level, right? We've seen Lasser get targeted 9+ times in all 3 of his recent games. He finished with 100+ yards in 2 of them, and there's been about a 50-50 shot whether or not he'd find the end zone. Right, but given his role as the top option, I think those opportunities are absolutely going to continue. He's been very effective whenever BYU specifically is forced into a shootout, as last year's biggest games have came against, Baylor and Oklahoma, 2 teams that BYU had to fight tooth and nail for wins against. I think Lasser is a pretty solid flex option moving forward in your leagues, right? This weekend's option or this weekend's game is actually pretty enticing against UCF. I love this matchup quite a bit because UCF's defense is very kind of Jekyll and Hyde-ish, right? They're borderline elite versus the run. They're 17th in the country in defensive rushing team performance, but their secondary has been a major problem all year long. UCF is 100th in the country in defensive passing team performance, right? If that holds up, and BYU can't effectively run the ball, and throwing the ball is really the only way BYU can effectively move the ball against UCF. Like, Lassiter may be in for his biggest performance this upcoming weekend. So I might double dip here. I might have Lassiter as my start later on this week. But after this week, you get a bye, and then you face Utah. Obviously, I don't love that stretch, but then they go back to normal Big 12 games after that. And I think that Lassiter will have himself some nice matchups down the line. So let's move on to our second wide receiver, and that is Mr. Eric Rivers, wide receiver out of Florida International here, rostered on 10% of leagues. If you listened to last week's start-sit episode with Justin Leo, aka Volume Pigs, you will know that I actually listed Eric Rivers as a start in that format. And had myself a pretty nice day here. Again, 8 targets, 5 catches, 91 yards, and a touchdown against UTEP this past week. And the thing about Rivers is we all love guys who can kind of take over a week, almost single-handedly put our matchups away in CFF. The guys that can score 40 points, and that completely changes the outlook of your game. But there's also some value to be found in consistency. Right? Guys that aren't going to, win you the week, but they're not going to fully bust on you either. And Eric Rivers, he fits that to a T. Right? He's been scarily consistent the last couple of weeks. Over the last 5 games, his targets have varied between 6 and 13, but this dude always manages to finish the game somewhere between 91 and 101 yards and about a 50-50 shot at getting a touchdown, right? He fills the deep threat role for this Panthers offense, right? He's averaging 18.1 yards per catch. His average depth of target is as far as 15 yards down the field. Crazy thing is he could have had an even bigger performance the last couple of weeks. He's had 6 drops during that time, 2 of which were 20-plus yards down the field. Almost certainly would have been touchdowns. If he can clean that up, Rivers could be in for a monster stretch down here. Speaking of monster stretch, he's got a tough matchup against Sam Houston this weekend, whose defense is surprisingly pretty solid against the pass. They're 18th in the country in defensive passing team performance. But then, man, once they get past that, if he can keep doing what he's doing against Sam Houston, it is wheels up. I'm not kidding. People ask me all the time, like, all right, who's a guy that you could have who can have a really, really good playoff schedule? Surprisingly, Eric Rivers. Because, listen to this end of the year schedule here, right? After Sam Houston, they get New Mexico State, who's 105th who's in defensive passing team performance. Jacksonville State, who's 95th. Kennesaw State, who's 121st. And then they get MTSU to finish the year, who is dead freaking last in the country in defensive passing team performance. You could not ask for a better stretch for any wide receiver, in my opinion. Now, unfortunately, it is Florida International, and they're not exactly a powerhouse passing game, right? Keon Jenkins is not it when it comes to throwing the ball. But if he can just keep it consistent with Rivers, you have yourself a really solid pickup off the waiver wire as a guy that can really help you plug some holes, especially during bye weeks, right? Where you're sitting there wondering, all right, I just need a guy that can get me 15 points. Rivers is going to be that guy for you every single week. Last wide receiver I'm going to touch on here is Mr. True Edwards, the wide receiver out of Louisiana Tech, rostered on 6% of leagues. This past week against UTEP, targeted 12 times, 9 catches, 110 yards, and 2 touchdowns on the day. I will fully admit, I have not watched a single minute of Louisiana Tech football this year. This is a team that I completely written off. And based on their offensive performance so far, they're 100th in the country. I wasn't exactly wrong to do so, but, even out of bad offenses, it does appear that you can get true number 1 wide receivers that are clearly the best option on their offense. And True Edwards seems to be that guy for the Bulldogs, right? He's been the target hog for the Bulldogs for a bit now. He has 42 targets on the season so far this year, almost doubling the next closest receiver in Jay Wilkerson. However, recently those targets, until recently, those targets hadn't translated to actual production outside of the game against NC State, right? The major difference recently has been the switch to Evan Bullock at quarterback. Bullock's completion percentage is 10% higher than either of Jack Turner or Baker, who came in before. He's also willing to push the ball down the field just a little bit more. Overall, he's just kind of giving his receivers a bit more of a chance to actually come down with the ball consistently, right? It has been a major benefit to Edwards, who's gotten plenty of targets, just the reception percentage has not gone up until recently, which you can really see in his last 2 games, right? He's had 19 targets during this stretch. Both games he's hit 110 plus yards and at least a touchdown in them. Louisiana Tech, they're 2-4. I don't think they have a ton to play for, but if they do want to try to get to bowl eligibility, one, they have a really nice schedule coming up, right? So that is still possible for them. But also, too, if they're going to accomplish that, they're going to have to run through a guy like True Edwards, and I think that he is going to be a phenomenal play over the next couple of weeks, right? They got a very CUSA-centric schedule, much like Eric Rivers and FIU, right? That'll benefit Edwards quite a bit. I will say, though, they do have a trip to Arkansas in the semifinals week, which is a really, really tough draw for Edwards. But other than that, they're facing so many of the same teams that FIU is. All those teams I just talked about, how far down their defensive passing team performance has been this year. Edwards is going up against a lot of those guys as well. He also gets Western Kentucky, who's also pretty bad against the pass. So, all that being said, I like where Edwards is going. I like his growing role here. I like that Louisiana Tech's offense is getting a little bit better each week, and I think Edwards will be a huge, huge part of it moving forward. So, with all that being said, let's move on to my one tight end for the week. I'll throw out my honorable mentions first real quick. Actually, Blake Bosma and Terrence Carter, these are 2 guys that have performed well this past week. I mean, Bosma scored 3 touchdowns. Terrence Carter had over 100 yards, some pretty massive plays in the game for Louisiana. So I would say that both those guys are worth picking up. But also, if you're looking for a reliable option in CFF, I think Jack Endries is your guy right now. He's rostered on 25% of leagues. Again, this past week, 11 targets, 9 receptions, 101 yards. Didn't find the end zone, but he found the end zone the last 2 weeks before that. So I think it's only a matter of time before he ends up back there. Like I said, if you're looking for reliable tight end options in CFF, tight ends who lead their team in targets are always a great place to look, right? It is a little weird, though, that we're seeing this tight end emerge so late in the season, right? It makes me question his sustainability just a little bit, but as we've seen today, sometimes coaches and analysts like myself take a while to kind of adjust their approaches, and I think that might be what's happening here with Endries out of California, right? Like I mentioned, he leads Cal's receiving weapons and targets. 23 of them have come in the last 3 weeks. Just to give you an idea of before that point, he had only 9 targets on the season, and then this past week, 23. So it's pretty clear that the coaching staff has adjusted their approach and they've made him a pretty major part of the game plan. He's hit 100 plus yards and 8 plus targets in each of his last 2 games. He also found 2 touchdowns, like I said, in not this past week, but the weeks before. He had a touchdown in each of those games. I don't love the schedule coming up for Cal, right? Nothing really screams shootouts or anything or mismatches for tight ends, but with tight ends, you don't have to play that game as much as wide receivers, right? If you can just get a tight end that you can consistently place, 8 targets to every single week, you're looking at a pretty good option at the position. So that's my play at tight end, Jack Endries out of Cal. Let's quickly touch upon our defensive or our DST plays of the week, our DST streaming options, which, by the way, I'm going to toot my own horn a little bit here. We nailed 3 out of the 4 defenses last week. Completely crapped the bed on recommending Rutgers versus UCLA because, good Lord, Rutgers, what the heck happened? But South Carolina destroyed Oklahoma's offense. That was beautiful. Who else we did? Wisconsin held Northwestern to 3 points. And then who else? had one more that did really, really solid. Can't remember now. We'll move on to the ones for this week, and I got 3 here that I like quite a bit. So the first one we'll do here is Michigan State going up against Michigan. I would recommend Michigan as well, but they're already rostered in as many leagues that allow DST pretty much as well, versus Michigan State's kind of out there. And here's the thing: when you're picking DSTs to stream, you don't just pick good defenses. You gotta pick on the offenses a little bit. There are certain offenses in this country that are just completely falling apart. And unless your defense is just like straight up god awful, like to give an example, like last week, I thought about recommending Middle Tennessee State's defense against Kennesaw State, right? Because Kennesaw State's offense is absolutely atrocious. More on that in a second. But Middle Tennessee State's defense was also pretty atrocious. So I'm like, you get stoppable force versus very movable object. I didn't really want to bet on that. Now, it turns out Middle Tennessee State held Kennesaw State to 3 points regardless. So, whoop-de-doo. But to me, it is always better to just pick on bad offenses, right? And that's what I'm doing here. Michigan State, they're going up against Michigan. I think Michigan State smells some blood in the water here, right? Michigan is atrocious on offense. They can't get anything going. And as much as like Michigan State's kind of been an afterthought in a lot of people's minds this year, unless you are a Michigan State fan, like they haven't been bad so far this year, right? Their defensive performance ratings have been solid. And again, like I'm looking at their overall record here, right? They're 4-3, they're 3 losses. They took a bad loss versus Boston College, I'll admit that. But then, they took L's to Oregon and Ohio State. Like, nobody's going to really fault them for that. They had a really good win, in my opinion, against Iowa this past week. A solid win on the road at Maryland. Like, everybody's like, oh, that's not super impressive. Maryland just took down USC. So, like, and Iowa body bagged Washington. So, like, for Michigan State to get some wins over them is pretty solid. I think that they are more than talented enough to completely body Michigan's offense this week. I think they're just as talented as, like, the likes of Illinois. So I like Michigan State's defense this upcoming week. Liberty versus Kennesaw State. I already said we're picking on Kennesaw State's offense here a little bit, and I'm doing it again because I love my Owls, man, but they are garbage. They're awful. And then the other part of this is that Liberty is well rested. They've played 1 game in the last 3 weeks. They have had themselves a nice little break. And they're going to come into this game. They're well rested. It's a terrible offense they're facing up against. They are a team that is still kind of in the hunt for a potential playoff spot, right? They are undefeated at this point. I think they're going to want to leave no doubt. I think Liberty absolutely body bags Kennesaw State this weekend. And that their DST is a solid play off the waiver wire. And then last but not least, we're going to look at Louisville going up against Boston College here, right? Boston College, their offense has not been anything to write home about. 105th in the country in yards per game. They have been struggling to score pretty consistently over the last couple of weeks. Let me see if I can pull up their schedule here real quick. Thought I had this written down, but turns out I did not. Yeah, like let's take a look. Let's take a look at like what they've been able to put up in recent games, right? They 28 points versus Florida State. Cool. Awesome. 56 points against Duquesne. All right, whatever. 21 points versus Missouri. Okay, that's a solid road game performance. But then 19 points versus Michigan State. Or excuse me, 23 points versus Michigan State. 21 points versus Western Kentucky. Okay, that's a little concerning. 14 points versus Virginia. And then they put up 21 points versus Virginia Tech this week. But if you watch that game, almost every single one of those points came off of turnovers. Like Virginia Tech just being stupid to start the second half. And so I legit think that this offense is getting worse and worse. And Louisville's got themselves a pretty stingy defense here, right? Like if we're looking at Louisville's defensive performances, they're 38th in the country in defensive team performance. They're 23rd in rushing team performance defensively, 57th versus the pass, which is like, all right, but like you're facing Thomas Castellanos, all right? You're a little bit more worried about the run, and that's where Louisville has specialized in, right? So I like the matchup with Louisville versus Boston College this week. I think that Louisville is perfectly capable of holding Boston College to less than 2 scores. It's probably the one I feel the least comfortable with out of these 3, but I don't know, right in the hot wave. So with all that, we've come to the end of our show. Appreciate all of you guys listening. If you have not already, make sure you, like I said before, leave a like, comment, subscribe if you're on the YouTube side of things. If you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show and leave a 5-star review wherever you are listening. Make sure you check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy game. We'll see you guys back here on Wednesday with myself and Justin Leo, aka Volume Pigs, where we'll get you prepared for week 9 of the season with your start-sit questions and our own start-sit players. Until then, appreciate you guys, and I hope you guys have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.